The restaurant was alive with the soft hum of diners, clinking glasses, and the murmur of conversations flowing through the air. The warm lighting painted the room in amber tones, and the scent of garlic and roasted herbs wafted from the open kitchen. It was an atmosphere crafted to comfort and charm, but David sat alone at his corner table stirring his wine absently, distracted by thoughts he didn't want to linger on. He wasn't usually one to dine alone, but the day had demanded it. A long series of meetings, a missed flight, and a canceled dinner plan left him adrift in a city that wasn't his own. Still, he'd heard good things about this place, and something about its quiet sophistication had drawn him in. The waiter caught his eye almost immediately. It wasn't just that he was handsome, though there was no denying it. Sharp cheekbones, dark, neatly combed hair, and eyes that seemed to shimmer like wet onyx beneath the light. His uniform was crisp, tailored just so, but it was the way he moved, poised yet effortless, that made David pause. When the waiter approached, there was something almost magnetic about him. "Good evening," he said, his voice low and smooth, with a faint accent that David couldn't quite place. "Have you decided, or shall I give you a few more moments?" David looked up, startled out of his thoughts. He fumbled for the menu, suddenly feeling acutely self-conscious under the man's gaze. It was sharp, but not unkind, like he was used to reading people quickly and thoroughly. "No, I think I'm ready," David replied, though his mind was still catching up to the moment. He rattled off his order, and the waiter nodded, his pen moving briskly across his notepad. "Excellent choice," the waiter said, his lips curving into a subtle smile as he collected the menu. "I'll get this to the kitchen right away." He turned and left, but David's eyes lingered on him as he weaved through the tables. There was something oddly captivating about him, a quiet intensity in his demeanor, a precision in the way he carried himself. David took a sip of his wine, trying to shake the feeling, but it was impossible to ignore the way his pulse quickened each time the waiter moved past. It was ridiculous, he told himself. He was just tired, his brain overanalyzing every detail in a futile attempt to keep him entertained. When the waiter returned with the appetizer, his presence felt more vivid than before. He placed the plate in front of David with care, his long fingers brushing the edge of the table. "Enjoy," he said, but as he straightened, his eyes lingered for a fraction of a second too long. David swallowed hard. He told himself it was nothing, that he was imagining the flicker of something unspoken in the waiter's gaze. But when the man returned to check on him moments later, the tension only thickened. "Is everything to your liking?" the waiter asked. His voice was soft, but his words felt loaded, like a thread that could unravel into something more if pulled. "Yes, it's great," David replied, though he barely tasted the food. The waiter hesitated, and for a moment, David thought he was about to say something more. But then he gave a polite nod and stepped away. The meal continued, but the air around David seemed charged now, every interaction with the waiter adding to the quiet, insistent tension building between them. By the time dessert was served, David could barely focus on the rich chocolate tart in front of him. When the waiter brought the check, David felt a strange pang of disappointment. This was it, the end of a fleeting, inexplicable connection. But as the man set the folder on the table, his fingers lingered just a little too long against David's. David looked up sharply, meeting the waiter's eyes. For a split second, everything else in the room disappeared. "I hope you enjoyed your evening," the waiter said, his voice lower than before. His lips curved into a knowing smile, and for the first time all night, David allowed himself to hold the gaze, his breath catching as something unspoken passed between them. The moment stretched between them, fragile and electric. David could feel his pulse in his throat as he met the waiter's gaze, unable to look away. It was a look that seemed to strip away the carefully crafted pretense of professionalism, revealing something raw and unguarded underneath. Then, just as quickly, the waiter stepped back, severing the connection like a thread snapped clean. David fumbled with his wallet, the sudden loss of that tension leaving him restless, almost hollow. He placed his card in the check folder and glanced around the room, but his eyes inevitably returned to the waiter. The man had retreated to the far side of the dining room, speaking briefly to another guest before disappearing through a door marked Staff Only. His absence left an ache David couldn't name. It wasn't just attraction. It couldn't be. It was deeper, rooted in something he didn't fully understand, something that made the room feel colder, lonelier, without that fleeting attention. The check returned with a practiced efficiency, though not by the waiter. David's name was scrawled across the receipt in looping script, accompanied by a discreet number beneath it. No explanation. Just an invitation. David stared at the slip. The numbers burned into his vision. His first instinct was disbelief. It had to be a mistake, right? Or some internal policy he didn't understand. Maybe for high-spending customers? But no, that would be absurd. He folded the receipt with trembling hands, sliding it into his pocket before he could talk himself out of it. On the way out, he couldn't help but glance toward the staff-only door again, half hoping for another glimpse of the man who'd upended his evening. The cool night air hit him like a wave, snapping him back into the present. The city buzzed faintly around him, neon signs flickering overhead, casting shifting light across the wet pavement. He walked to his hotel without thinking, his mind still tangled with what had happened and what might come next. Once inside his room, David found himself pacing the floor. He pulled the receipt from his pocket, running his thumb over the ink as if trying to decode the meaning behind it. His phone sat on the nightstand, silent and expectant, like a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But the number called to him, tempting him in a way he couldn't rationalize. Before he could stop himself, he grabbed his phone and dialed. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "David," the waiter said, and the sound of his name spoken in that smooth, low tone sent a shiver down his spine. "You." David faltered. He hadn't thought this far ahead, hadn't prepared for what he would say. "You left your number," he managed finally. "I did." The waiter's voice carried a trace of amusement, as if he'd been expecting the call, certain it would come. David hesitated. "Why?" There was a pause, long enough for David to doubt everything. Then the waiter replied, his tone dipping into something softer, almost intimate. "Because I wanted to see you again." David's breath caught. "You don't even know me." "No," the waiter agreed, "but I'd like to." The words were simple, but they unraveled something tightly wound inside David. He sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the phone as if it might slip away. "When?" he asked before he could lose his nerve. "Tonight," the waiter said. "I finish my shift in an hour. There's a bar 2 blocks from the restaurant, the Velvet Room. Meet me there?" David's heart raced as he agreed, barely able to process what he was committing to. The Velvet Room was exactly what its name suggested: dim, plush, and intimate. The kind of place where conversations felt heavier under the weight of low lighting and sultry jazz. David sat at the bar, nursing a whiskey he barely tasted, the minutes dragging like hours. When the waiter arrived, he was no longer wearing the crisp uniform, replaced instead by a fitted black shirt and dark jeans that clung just enough to highlight his lean frame. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention without effort. "David," he said with a slight smile as he slid onto the stool beside him. "Do you always invite strangers to bars after work?" David asked, his voice tinged with a nervous humor that he hoped masked how unmoored he felt. The waiter chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Only the ones who can't stop staring at me during dinner." David flushed, but before he could stammer out a reply, the waiter's hand brushed his arm, a light, deliberate touch that sent sparks racing under his skin. "Relax," the waiter murmured. "I don't bite." "Who are you?" David asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. The waiter leaned closer, his voice dropping into a near whisper. "My name's Matteo." The name suited him, smooth and striking, just like the man himself. They talked for what felt like hours, though the time blurred as the conversation deepened. Matteo was sharp and attentive, with a dry wit that set David at ease despite the persistent undercurrent of tension between them. At some point, Matteo's hand found its way to David's knee, a light, grounding weight that lingered even as their conversation meandered. David couldn't tell if it was deliberate, but he didn't care. He found himself leaning into the touch, drawn closer by a gravity he couldn't resist. "I should get going," Matteo said eventually, though his tone lacked conviction. David hesitated, the words bubbling up before he could stop them. "You don't have to." For a long moment, Matteo studied him, his gaze dark and unreadable. Then he nodded. "Let's go," he said, his voice low and certain. They walked back to David's hotel in silence, the air between them crackling with an unspoken charge. The walk to the hotel was quiet but electric. Each step they took felt like a deliberate move toward a line that neither of them was ready to acknowledge, but both knew they would cross. David's mind raced, every rational thought drowned out by the hum of anticipation. Beside him, Matteo walked with the same effortless confidence he'd shown in the restaurant, but there was something more now, a purposefulness to his stride, a glint in his eyes when they briefly met David's. The elevator ride to David's room was a blur, a charged silence filling the small space as they stood side by side. Matteo's reflection in the mirrored walls caught David's eye, the sharp angles of his face softened by the low lighting, his mouth set in a faint, almost playful smile. It made David's stomach twist in a way he hadn't felt in years, a heady mix of nerves and want. When the doors slid open, Matteo gestured for David to lead the way. His footsteps were quiet on the carpeted hallway, but the sound of David's own heartbeat seemed deafening in his ears. By the time they reached his door, his hands trembled as he slid the keycard into the slot, the small green light flashing an invitation he barely comprehended. The door clicked shut behind them, and for a moment they stood in the dim light of the entryway, the weight of the silence pressing down on them. David could feel Matteo's gaze on him, heavy and unreadable, and when he finally turned to meet it, the air between them seemed to ripple. "I don't usually do this," David said, the words clumsy and thin. He didn't know why he said it, whether it was an attempt at humor or a plea for Matteo to set the pace. Matteo's lips curved into a small smile, and he stepped closer, his movements unhurried, deliberate. "Neither do I," he murmured, his voice low and warm. The distance between them vanished in a single breath. Matteo's hand came to rest lightly on David's shoulder, the touch sending a rush of heat through him. His thumb brushed against the fabric of David's shirt, an almost absent-minded motion that spoke of control and intent. David barely had time to process the contact before Matteo leaned in, his lips brushing against David's in a kiss that was soft but unrelenting. It wasn't a question or a tentative exploration. It was a declaration, a pulling of the thread that had been binding them together all night. David responded instinctively, his hands finding Matteo's waist, gripping him as if afraid he might disappear. The kiss deepened, slow and consuming, Matteo's lips warm and insistent against his own. David's thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind, leaving nothing but the weight of Matteo's body pressing against his, the taste of him lingering on his tongue. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads nearly touching. Matteo's hands slid down David's arms, leaving trails of fire in their wake until they came to rest lightly on his hips. His gaze met David's, dark and intent, and in that moment it felt like the room around them had melted away. "Tell me to stop," Matteo said softly, his voice roughened by the strain of holding back. David shook his head, his grip on Matteo tightening. "Don't." That single word seemed to snap whatever restraint Matteo had been clinging to. He kissed David again, harder this time, his hands roaming with a confidence that made David's knees weak. The edge of the bed caught the back of his thighs, and he let Matteo guide him down, his back meeting the mattress with a soft thud. Matteo hovered over him, his weight pressing down just enough to keep him grounded, his hands tracing slow, deliberate paths over David's chest and shoulders. Each touch sent a fresh wave of heat coursing through him, his breaths coming faster as Mateo's lips moved from his mouth to his jaw, then lower, leaving a trail of soft, heated kisses against his neck. David arched into the contact, his fingers tangling in Mateo's hair, pulling him closer as if afraid the moment might dissolve. Mateo's hands moved lower, skimming over David's sides before settling on his waist, his grip firm but careful. "You're sure?" Mateo asked, his voice barely more than a whisper against David's skin. "Yes," David breathed, the word escaping before he could think to hold it back. Mateo pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, and whatever he saw there must have been enough because his expression shifted, hunger and purpose mingling in a way that left David breathless. Clothes fell away in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each piece shedding another layer of pretense until there was nothing left but bare skin and the quiet sounds of their breathing. Mateo's hands and lips explored with a precision that left David trembling, his body responding to every touch like it had been waiting for this, for him. The rest of the world ceased to exist. It was just them, tangled together in the soft glow of the bedside lamp, the warmth of Mateo's body a stark contrast to the cool sheets beneath them. Every movement, every kiss, felt inevitable, like a script they'd been following without ever having read it. When the tension finally broke, it wasn't with an explosion, but with a slow, profound unraveling. They clung to each other as the waves of release washed over them, their breaths mingling in the quiet aftermath. Mateo collapsed beside him, his arm draped loosely over David's chest. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy, but comforting. David closed his eyes, letting the weight of the moment settle over him, a quiet sense of completeness blooming in his chest. Finally, Mateo broke the silence, his voice a soft rumble against David's ear. "So, does this mean you'll be back at the restaurant tomorrow?" David laughed, the sound light and unguarded. "Maybe," he said, turning to look at Mateo, his lips curving into a smile. "If you're there." Mateo's smile widened and he leaned in to press a soft, lingering kiss to David's lips. "I'll be there," he murmured. The night didn't end with the kiss. The moments after felt suspended, filled with a warmth that neither could quite articulate. Mateo stayed close, his hand idly tracing patterns along David's arm as they lay together. The soft rhythm of their breathing filled the room, punctuated only by the occasional murmur of the city outside the window. David turned his head slightly, studying Mateo in the dim light. There was a tenderness to his expression now, a quiet vulnerability that hadn't been there before. It made David's chest ache in a way he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. "You do this often?" David asked softly, the words slipping out before he could think better of them. Mateo's lips twitched, a wry smile ghosting across his face. "What? Sweep strangers off their feet and into their hotel beds?" David chuckled, though the sound was quiet, subdued. "Something like that." Mateo shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could meet David's gaze fully. "No," he said after a moment, his voice serious now. "I don't. It's not something I planned." The honesty in his tone caught David off guard, leaving him momentarily unsure of how to respond. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that seemed to convey everything he couldn't put into words. They lay there in silence for a while longer, the weight of the evening settling around them. David could feel the pull of sleep creeping in, his body heavy with exhaustion but his mind unwilling to let go of the moment. Eventually, Mateo spoke again, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I should probably go." David's chest tightened, though he wasn't sure why. "You don't have to," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Mateo's eyes searched his for a long moment, and then he smiled, something small and genuine. "Okay," he said simply. They drifted off like that, tangled together under the soft glow of the bedside lamp, the quiet intimacy of the moment wrapping around them like a cocoon. Morning arrived in a slow, golden haze. The light filtered through the curtains in pale streaks, casting a warm glow over the room. David stirred first, blinking groggily as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. Matteo was still there, his arm draped across David's waist, his face relaxed in sleep. David allowed himself a moment to just watch him. The rise and fall of his chest, the faint crease between his brows that hadn't entirely smoothed even in sleep. He felt a pang of something, gratitude, maybe, or longing, that he didn't dare examine too closely. Matteo stirred eventually, his eyes fluttering open as he blinked against the light. When he saw David watching him, a slow smile spread across his face. "Morning," Matteo murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," David replied, his own smile soft but genuine. For a moment, neither of them moved, the weight of the day ahead pressing in on them. Then Matteo stretched, his movements languid and unhurried as he propped himself up on one elbow. "Regrets yet?" he asked, though his tone was light, teasing. David shook his head. "Not one." The honesty in his voice seemed to catch Matteo off guard, his teasing smile softening into something more serious. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against David's cheek in a gesture so tender it made David's breath hitch. "I should probably let you get on with your day," Matteo said after a moment, though there was no urgency in his tone. David hesitated, his mind torn between wanting to hold on to the moment and knowing it couldn't last. "What if I don't want you to go?" he asked quietly, the vulnerability in his words leaving him feeling exposed. Matteo's gaze softened, and for a moment he didn't say anything, his thumb tracing small circles against David's skin. "Then maybe I don't have to," he said finally, his voice low and steady. It wasn't a promise, not exactly, but it was enough. The hours that followed were a blur of quiet conversation and stolen touches, a slow unraveling of the distance that had once separated them. Matteo stayed, his presence filling the room in a way that made it feel less like a temporary space and more like a haven. They shared breakfast on the edge of the bed, a spread of pastries and coffee delivered by room service, their laughter mingling with the faint clatter of plates. Matteo's wit was sharp, his humor dry, and David found himself laughing more freely than he had in weeks, months even. When Matteo finally left, the room felt achingly empty in his absence. David stood at the window for a long time after, his gaze fixed on the street below, but his thoughts somewhere else entirely. It was absurd, he told himself. They'd barely known each other a day, and yet Matteo had slipped into his life with a seamlessness that left David off balance. He didn't know what came next, didn't even know if there would be a next. But the thought of not seeing Matteo again left an ache he couldn't ignore. He sighed, running a hand through his hair as he turned away from the window. On the nightstand, a slip of paper caught his eye. The receipt from the restaurant, Matteo's number scrawled across it. David picked it up, his thumb brushing over the ink. He didn't know what he was hoping for or where this might lead, but as he saved the number to his phone, a small, unbidden smile curved his lips. Maybe this wasn't the end of the story. The days that followed were quieter than David had expected. His work pulled him into a relentless cycle of meetings and obligations, the kind that left little time for reflection but somehow even less for distraction. Yet Matteo lingered in his thoughts like a melody he couldn't shake. He caught himself checking his phone too often, hoping for a text that hadn't come, debating whether to be the one to reach out. Matteo's name sat in his contacts, a silent invitation taunting him each time he scrolled past. It wasn't until the following Friday that David finally gave in. He was back in his own city now, his hotel replaced by the familiar walls of his apartment, but Matteo's absence felt sharper here. With a deep breath, he tapped out a message. "David, hey Matteo, hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." He hovered over the send button longer than he cared to admit before finally pressing it. His stomach twisted as he waited, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. When his phone buzzed, the relief was immediate and overwhelming. Matteo. "Never a bad time for you. How are you, David?" David smiled despite himself, his fingers moving over the screen before he could second guess. David. "Better now." "You?" The reply came quickly. Matteo. "Busy, but not so busy I can't make time for you. What's on your mind?" David hesitated, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to see Matteo again, but the thought of asking felt strangely daunting. David. "I was wondering if you'd like to grab a drink. If you're free, that is." The seconds ticked by, his heart thundering in his chest until Matteo's response appeared. Matteo. "I thought you'd never ask. When and where?" David's relief spilled out in a quiet laugh, and they quickly settled on a plan for the next evening. The bar they chose was upscale but unpretentious, the kind of place where the music was low enough for conversation, and the drinks came with thoughtful garnishes. David arrived first, securing a small table near the back, his nerves buzzing despite the intimate setting. When Matteo walked in, David's breath caught. Dressed casually in dark jeans and a tailored shirt, he exuded the same effortless confidence that had first drawn David in. Their eyes met across the room, and Matteo's slow smile sent a rush of warmth flooding through him. "You're here," David said as Matteo slid into the seat across from him, a little breathless despite himself. "Of course," Matteo replied smoothly, his tone carrying just a hint of teasing. "You asked, didn't you?" They ordered drinks, falling into an easy rhythm of conversation that surprised David with how natural it felt. Matteo talked about his life outside the restaurant, his passion for photography, the small gallery he was saving to open one day. David found himself sharing more than he expected, opening up about his career, his travels, even the quiet moments of doubt that crept in when he was alone too long. By the time the bar began to empty, the world outside had faded, leaving only the soft glow of their shared space. Matteo leaned closer, his elbow resting on the table, his gaze fixed on David with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "Stay out with me a little longer," Matteo said, his voice low but insistent. David nodded, the answer immediate and instinctive. "Where to?" Matteo smiled, and for a moment it felt like the rest of the night had already been written. They ended up walking the quiet streets of the city, the conversation flowing freely as they wove through pools of streetlight and shadow. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain, and David found himself drawn closer to Matteo with each step, as if gravity itself had shifted. When they reached a small park, Matteo stopped, turning to face David fully. The city hummed softly around them, but here, under the swaying branches of a nearby tree, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. "I've been thinking about you," Matteo admitted, his voice steady but low, as if speaking the words too loudly might break the spell. David's breath hitched, his chest tightening at the quiet honesty in Matteo's gaze. "You have?" Matteo stepped closer, his hands finding David's, his touch light but grounding. "I haven't been able to stop." David's pulse thundered in his ears, and before he could think better of it, he closed the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that was both familiar and electrifying, a continuation of a story that had been waiting to unfold. Matteo's hands slid to David's waist, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened. The world blurred, leaving nothing but the warmth of Matteo's body pressed against his, the soft sound of their breathing mingling in the quiet night. When they finally broke apart, Matteo rested his forehead against David's, his smile soft but unshakable. "What now?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Matteo's eyes sparkled, his grip on David tightening just slightly. "Whatever we want," he said. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough. Over the weeks that followed, Matteo became a constant in David's life. Their meetings grew more frequent, each one feeling like a discovery, an unraveling of the guarded edges they'd both built around themselves. Matteo introduced David to his favorite coffee shop, a small, hole-in-the-wall place with mismatched furniture and the best cappuccino David had ever tasted. David took Matteo to art galleries, watching as his face lit up with inspiration at the exhibits. Their lives began to intertwine, the quiet moments between them feeling as significant as the nights that blurred with passion. David found himself smiling more, laughing easier, his world shifting in ways he hadn't thought possible. But with that closeness came a new kind of fear, a vulnerability that left David questioning what they were building and whether it could last. One night, as they lay tangled together on David's couch, Matteo's head resting on his chest, David spoke the question that had been gnawing at him. "What are we doing, Matteo?" Matteo tilted his head to look up at him, his expression thoughtful but unshaken. "We're figuring it out," he said simply. David nodded, the answer not entirely satisfying but grounding in its honesty. And so they continued, uncertain but unwavering, two lives slowly threading together in a way that neither had expected but neither could resist.